We've got 3 head-to-head segments coming up for you today. We'll talk about Simon Edvinsson versus Dmitri Simashev, Thomas Harley versus Ville Heinola, and then finally we'll talk about Kaiden Guhle versus Alexander Nikishin. All coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi joined by Sebastian. Hi. And today we've got 3 head-to-head segments for you. We're going to be looking at different categories of players and how they compare. First, 2 fairly comparable players in Dmitri Simashev versus Simon Edvinsson. Simashev is an Arizona Coyotes prospect drafted very recently in the top 10 of the 2023 NHL draft. Now we got Simon Edvinsson, who's a Detroit Red Wings prospect, also drafted in the top 10 in his draft year. So they're fairly comparable players who will be kind of putting head-to-head and comparing in terms of upside, certainty, overall impact on the game. And then we'll be talking about Thomas Harley versus Ville Heinola, a pair of 2019 NHL draft defensemen drafted in the first round within the top 20, fairly similarly in terms of position in the first round. We'll compare their trajectory so far, how they project, if there's room for improvement in their games, and how they can reach their full potential. And then finally, we'll talk about 2 very similar players again, in Kaiden Guhle versus Alexander Nikishin, 2 decently sized, fairly physical players who are really good defensively but have some untapped offensive upside. We'll put them head to head in our third segment. Before we get into that, I just want to talk to you about our sponsor for today's episode. Today's sponsor is FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. New customers can bet $5 and get up to $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit fanduel.com/lockedon to get started. Again, that's fanduel.com/lockedon. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. Like we always say, we always leave the best comments for our mailbag questions and kind of break those down on the podcast. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So without further ado, let's jump into Dmitri Simashev versus Simon Edvinsson. First and foremost, before we start, who's your favorite to watch between the 2?
Ooh, I think I have to say Simashev. I have to. Simashev is one of my favorite defensemen to watch that haven't played NHL minutes yet in the league. Like it's tough. These are such comparable players, and it's like, why did we have to pick 2 that are so close? But both players, both Edvinsson and Simashev, are exceptional skaters. They're very, very big, but so fluid in their movements. They have very powerful strides. They use their mobility and their long reach to cover massive amounts of ice defensively. And while I do think that at the same age, Simashev is a far more effective and intelligent defender than Edvinsson is, Edvinsson had already shown a lot more of the offensive toolkit than Simashev has been able to at this stage of his career. So I would say where Simashev might project more likely as a shutdown defensive defenseman with good two-way ability, Edvinsson has that higher end offensive potential. But in terms of joy to watch, I have to go Simashev. He's one of my favorite defensemen, and Edvinsson in his draft year was a lot more frustrating to scout and to watch. There are a lot more mishaps in his play, and he was a lot less refined than Simashev is now, but obviously he had a couple years of that head start. So he's looking great for Detroit, and that pick is aging very, very nicely, but I have to side with Simashev here.
Oh, for sure. I mean, kudos to the Detroit Red Wings organization to just be able to predict which players have more runway to work on their game and improve, and which players especially are going to work on the right things. Edvinsson has developed wonderfully for them. I was a big skeptic in his draft year. I wasn't really sold on the defensive ability. I wasn't sold on the decision making, especially. There were some decisions they would make on the breakout that would just make me want to rip my hair out. So just to see that worked out of his game is fantastic. If we're talking about both of them in their draft years, by far Simashev was the most enjoyable to watch and the funnest to scout. But I'm looking at right now current Simon Edvinsson and current Dmitri Simashev, and I'm leaning Edvinsson in terms of the fun factor. It's a slight angle towards him. I really like what I see from him. It is very close, but I do really enjoy the way that Simon Edvinsson has developed his hockey sense, his awareness, his decision making. More often than not, he's making the right decisions on the ice, and more often than not, he's quarterbacking plays, not just on the power play, but at 5-on-5. He's basically jump starting plays on his own, dictating where the play goes. He's so fun to watch as he stands right now that I'm giving him the slight edge personally.
That's fair.
But to compare both in terms of upside, I mean, it's just, let's talk about impact on the game, because that's a part of a player's upside, right? I mean, between the two, who do you predict to be the most impactful overall?
There's so many factors. It's tough. I think that as of right now, it is more likely that Edvinsson becomes the more impactful player between the two.
Mhm.
But that is also including some of my doubts and my skepticism of how Arizona has been developing their young players recently, whereas
Yeah.
Detroit develops their players exceptionally well, and that's already been very, very clear with Edvinsson and how he's progressed in the last few seasons. And I think Simashev would have to be developing at a really high rate to catch up
Mhm.
with where Edvinsson is now in
Mhm.
terms of overall impact. I still I have a bigger soft spot in my heart for Simashev than I do for Edvinsson in terms of just overall enjoyability to watch.
Mhm.
But Edvinsson's looking so good, and I think that Arizona's development scares me a little bit too much to not give
Yeah.
the edge to Edvinsson on this one.
No, makes sense for sure, and especially the position that Edmondson could be in eventually beside Moritz Seider on a first pair. Like, my goodness,
Yeah, exactly.
that'd be a first pair for the ages. But yeah, no, for me, it's just you look at both of them, and I see the pathway for Simashev to kind of progress in certain areas, because he is a very daring player offensively. He's always trying new stuff, and I say it often, but exploration and trying new things is the best way in order to add tools to your toolkit and develop things that you wouldn't have developed had you not tried them. If a player is constantly trying things, it's very promising to me, because I can see that they're putting themselves in uncomfortable scenarios. They're not sticking to their comfort zone. That's the case for Simashev, but it's especially the case for Simon Edvinsson, who from the jump, I mean, in his draft year, that's one thing I really overlooked, is how often his mistakes were a result of trying things that are outside of his comfort zone. And that's what has led to him progressing so much. I still see Simashev as having the potential upside to be an offensive force, but he's nowhere near there right now. And I don't think that the runway is as long as it was for Edmondson in terms of improving his hockey sense, improving his decision making. Like, Edmondson had a lot more runway to work with and had the dare and mindset in order to make that work. Time will tell with Simashev versus Edmondson. I still think that at the end of the day, like you said, Edmondson will be the more impactful player, but that's not to say that Simashev won't be impactful. He certainly will. He's one of the best rush defending skaters I've seen. Him and David Reinbacher were pretty much head to head for me in terms of rush defending. It's just I saw more offensive upside in Simashev than Reinbacher. I'm surprised Reinbacher went first. At the same time, you're not, given the amount of points he put up in a pro league in
Yeah.
the Swiss National League, but there's a reason for that, and we've mentioned that before. But yeah, Simashev is still kind of my favorite defenseman from the 2023 draft class. But just Edvinsson is just that good. So again, Detroit has a gem here, and Arizona, if they work on him well and let him develop properly, we're talking about two fantastic defensemen at the pro level. But that wraps things up for our first segment. Now we're going to get into our second segment, including Thomas Harley and Ville Heinola, putting them head to head and seeing how they've progressed since their draft year in 2019. But before we get into that, Sebastian, talk us through our sponsor for today's episode.
Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you can get bonus bets for every single victory of theirs. And you can use this on pretty much anything, ranging from spreads to player props to over and unders and far, far more. So visit fanduel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's fanduel.com/lockedon.
Alrighty, moving on to our second segment. We'll talk about two 2019 NHL draft defensemen who were drafted in the top 20 but haven't quite panned out yet. We wanted to go back to 2019 to see how long the runway is in average for a defenseman and kind of give a benchmark for Harley and Heinola, because this year seems to be the year where they should be breaking out. Both of them have improved their point totals. Both of them have played some NHL minutes so far, but haven't stuck permanently to the lineup and made themselves staples. So we'll kind of talk about them both and kind of put them up head to head. Let's start with Thomas Harley. I know that you're a fan of what he brings and the upside that he could have. Talk me through that and what you see in him.
Thomas Harley is a fairly simple defenseman. He is quite reliable in his own zone. He's very mobile. He uses his mobility really well to close his gaps and keep them pretty tight. He's one of the better, like in my AHL viewings of him, he's among the better defensemen in that league in terms of matching footwork against the rush and really just keeping those gaps really, really tight. And I think the rush defending is one of the big reasons that I'm still quite a big fan of him. And while the offense hasn't fully popped yet, I do think that there have been flashes of him using his mobility and his offensive intelligence to kind of create plays. And while I don't think he's ever going to be a playmaker from the back end, I do think that he could become a decent enough distributor, maybe a second power play guy that can plug a hole when need be. And while I don't see any top pairing upside there, and there probably wasn't that much there to begin with when he was drafted, I still think he'd carve out a solid role as a number 4. And while I do think that would take a decent amount of steps forward, especially in terms of his defending against the cycle and in his overall offensive transition game and being a little bit more proactive and carrying the puck up himself a little bit more, because he can do it quite well when he tries and when he wants to. But those are all things that you see defensemen work on quite consistently in like the years after their draft. So I'm not too worried with Harley, but he's taking a little bit of time, and I can understand if Dallas fans are a little bit anxious about how he's progressing.
Yeah, no, it's definitely understandable. But I mean, you pointed to the very important things that he does so well. I mean, you're talking about a player who has the foundations of the game locked down. He just doesn't have that extra exploration gear. He doesn't have that extra creativity and originality and inventiveness and dare that a lot of defensemen with the same kind of profile have. And that's what makes them kind of develop tools to their game. Like you mentioned with Edvinsson and Simashev, it's so important to be daring enough to explore areas of your game you're not comfortable with. I feel like Harley's a fairly simplistic player in the sense that he sticks to what he does best. And that's good for support role players. You look at a Brett Kulak, you look at, players who are good in their specific identity as, a rush defender or a puck carrier or a breakout passer. They stick to their guns and they do it well, but most of those guys end up in bottom pair roles with, the occasional penalty killing or power play spot. But if you want to make it as a top 4 player defenseman, if you want to make it as a top pair defenseman, it is so important to be good enough in multiple areas of the game that you're comfortable reaching out and trying things that are a bit outside of your comfort zone, but that lead to good results. And, obviously once you get to the big show, it's very important to be good at those things so that you're not just, the time to develop and create and try new things in your game is your time spent in junior, your time spent in the AHL, because that's a time where you can afford to work on things where you can afford to try the high risk plays and see if they work. Once you get to the NHL, you try a high risk play, it fails, there's a turnover, it ends up in your net, you're on the bench, it's over. So it's a different benchmark, but I feel like a lot of players would benefit from understanding that they can take risks, they should take risks, and they have to take risks in order to develop in their game. And I feel like Harley's in that boat. But moving on to Heinola, I mean, we were talking about a player who was drafted in the top 20 in his draft year. He played right away off the bat for, I believe, the Winnipeg Jets. Right off the bat, he played, I believe, eight games, scored 5 points in his rookie year, and then was sent down. And since then, it's pretty much been the same thing every year. 5 games a year after, 10 games a year after, 12 games a year after. I mean, he hasn't stuck permanently to an NHL spot. And I can definitely understand if there's some concern from the team, in terms of where he stands, if he's developing, how he's developing. But you look at his AHL point totals, and they've climbed recently in the last year, right?
For sure. No, I mean, I believe he scored what, 37 points in 48 games last season in the AHL in his 21-year-old season, which is very impressive production. I'm always of the mind that consistency is key for prospects. That in large part, just giving prospects time to develop before really giving them NHL minutes is often a positive. But when you do decide to start playing a prospect in the NHL, I think it's vital to give them some type of consistency. You can't just give them 10 games a season here and there and then a healthy scratch for a couple of weeks. You have to just take the risk, right? Like, it might lead to slightly worse results in the short term, but you need to give a player a good stretch of 20 to 40 games in the NHL in a year to really see what they can do, because they need that consistency. They have to feel safe in their role and feel like they can make a mistake without getting benched immediately. And I think that one big issue in Heinola's development has just been that he's been playing in like such small spurts in the NHL where he has one bad game and he gets sent down. And I don't know how he's really meant to develop to the best of his abilities when he's being treated that way. And at the same time, his AHL results have continued to improve. So I'm hoping that he gets a full-time NHL shot this season. But if it's more of the same, I'll start getting a bit concerned of the overall long-term projection, because you need some form of stability. And I think he's at the point where he's kind of proven everything he can prove at the AHL level and needs to just be given a shot at the big leagues.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, you look at them both, you look at Harley and Heinola in a vacuum, their skill sets are different. I mean, like you said, Harley's a more simplistic player. I see Heinola as a bit more high risk of a player. He's the type of player who's going to try things, is going to push the pace. At least from what I watched in his draft year, I was really impressed with his ability to connect on high risk plays, to try those high risk plays to start with and to see them to start with. I mean, that was really something I was impressed with Heinola. He's a good breakup passer, fluid skater. Does struggle defending the rush. His gap control isn't ideal, but maybe that progressed in the year since I've watched him in his draft year. I'd be fairly certain that there has been some improvement in that respect. But for me, I don't want Heinola falling into the trap of playing to keep his head above water. And if that's all he's doing every time he gets called up, it's not going to be good for his development in the slightest. But if you're able to give him a role in the AHL that is very consistent. Let's say he's playing on the top pair every game for the first 40 games of the season. And by the 40th game of the season, he's almost at a point per game. He's doing well like he did last year. Call him up, instead of giving him 5 games, tell him, hey, you're going to be in the lineup for 15 games. You're going to be playing in this specific role. You're not going to be varying at all from this role. This is going to be the role you're going to be playing for the entire duration of your tenure here for 15 games. So enjoy it. Get comfortable, relax, get into your comfort zone, and just start trying things. You will see a great improvement in Heinola's game, because right now, from what I've seen, every time he's come up to the NHL, he looks like a player just begging to keep his head above water. And if that's the mindset he's having, he's going to be making all the low risk plays. He's not going to be trying anything that he wouldn't try. So that's not what you want from a player as they're developing. You want them exploring. You want them adding tools to their toolkit. And Heinola has a great opportunity to do that if he's developed properly, because I do believe that the high risk, daring, offensively gifted Heinola that I saw in his draft year is a real Heinola. It's just a matter of bringing that out of his game. So time will tell with those two again. But between the two, who are you picking? Let's say you're an NHL team looking to add a prospect. They're both available on waivers, let's say. Who do you take?
I mean, I'd try to claim both, but I'd be siding with Thomas Harley. I think. I think that while I think between the two, Heinola is the more likely to me build himself a second pairing role. I could see. I think that Thomas Harley is already a pretty effective bottom pairing defenseman, and has a decent chance at becoming a number 5 and an outside shot at becoming a number 4. Whereas with Heinola, it's kind of looking like there's going to be a crossroads coming pretty soon, where he's either going to make it with his offensive style, or he's just going to be a career AHLer, kind of like Sami Niku. And we've seen that trend happen in Winnipeg before with a similar style of player. And I think I'd be picking Thomas Harley here, but it's pretty tight. And I think it all depends on like organizational need too, of if you already have like 6 set defensemen and you don't really need that bottom pairing presence, then sure, take the swing on Heinola. But I think the likely value is going to be higher with Harley here.
No, certainly. I'm fully of the same mind there. That wraps things up for our second segment. Now we'll talk about two very, very interesting defensemen with similar profiles in Kaiden Guhle versus Alexander Nikishin. We'll talk about it coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects. All right, so moving on to our final segment. Let's talk about Kaiden Guhle, a 17th overall pick of the Montreal Canadiens in 2021, versus Alexander Nikishin, who was a 69th overall pick. Very nice. In, I believe, the 2020 NHL draft. Is that right?
Correct.
Exactly, yeah. So those two have very similar profiles, I feel. I mean, you're talking about two players who are decent skaters, who defend the rush aggressively and physically, who have that physical presence, but also have some untapped offensive upside. Alexander Nikishin came out of nowhere this year, scoring almost a point per game in the KHL as a defenseman.
Yep.
Having watched a couple of his games and kind of broken down how he creates offense, that's what's very, very similar to Kaiden Guhle for me. He's not a pure puck carrier. He's not going to dangle through offensive teams and, stick handle around players and thread passes through lanes and all that stuff. He's an activator in the offensive zone. He'll push the back posts and kind of create a bit of chaos by his offensive drives in the offensive zone. So basically he delegates the puck and then pushes the back posts, and that's where he kind of parks himself and waits for a tap in or that kind of thing. He's also fairly decent at getting pucks on net from the point, which is another thing that Kaiden Guhle's good at, and another way that he creates points. So I feel like their offensive profiles are fairly similar. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've seen so far, Kaiden Guhle has the pure defensive upside that Alexander Nikishin doesn't. I feel like Guhle has a much more solid base of defensive tools. He could become one of the best shutdown defensemen in the NHL one day if he's developed properly. You're talking about a fantastic skater, a very fluid and powerful skater with one of the most punishing mindset. I mean, any player that comes down his side of the boards is looking for trouble, essentially, is how I see it.
Pretty much. I mean, the violence in his game really does just exudes. Like he will hit you very, very hard, and it will hurt. That's the entire thing of Kaiden Guhle's game. And I agree. I think that the pure defensive upside with Guhle is higher than with Nikishin, but I also think that the pure offensive upside is higher with Nikishin than with Guhle. And I think like these are both two-way defensemen that can do a lot of things very well. But I still think that Kaiden Guhle needs to significantly work on his passing game in transition. I think he needs to still become a little bit more confident as a puck handler. I think the handling skill is there, and the mobility and the skating is there for him to be a really, really strong puck carrier from the blue line. But he just hasn't really gotten the confidence to do that consistently, neither in the WHL nor the NHL just yet. And I think that would be a big facet that he'd have to kind of learn to be more effective offensively, especially on the rush. And then on the cycle, we are starting to see him like pinch a bit higher in the offensive zone, like going as a shooting option around the hash mark sometimes, which is nice to see. But with Nikishin, you have a lot more rotations around the offensive zone of him going behind the net, really shifting defensive structures rather than just pinching up to the hash marks, which is kind of what Guhle does at his most offensive aggressiveness. But it's a tough comparable here because they are both really, really interesting prospects, and obviously one has had extended NHL minutes so far, which helps with projection, obviously, with Guhle. And with Nikishin, we still have to see how he plays on the smaller ice surface and how that affects his game. Though on the surface, the way he plays the game, I'm not too concerned with how that's going to translate. But you never know. It's never a certain thing with that. But how about you? How would you compare their offensive projection specifically?
Yeah, I mean, Alexander Nikishin's at over a point a game right now in the KHL at 5 points in 4 games. I mean, you're talking about a player who has the offensive upside. To put up points in the KHL already is very, very difficult. But to put up as many points as that as a defenseman in a league that's probably the second or third toughest league in the world. I mean, I see, it's not a concrete thing until we see him in the NHL putting up, point totals like he is right now. But I see Nikishin as the type of player who has a lot more different ways to score than Kaiden Guhle and different ways to put up points than Kaiden Guhle. Guhle's a very simplistic passer in transition. He's most likely going to delegate to a teammate and then park himself at the offensive blue line and kind of let plays develop. And if he sees an opportunity, he might push down to the circles. But I've seen Nikishin just kind of shove his way to the front of the net and basically just, you know, collect rebounds, cycle them well, reload on top of the puck, close down on the slot, take a shot. Like he's genuinely a very versatile offensive player, which I was very surprised with. The only thing I'd say with Nikishin is he's not necessarily a pure high-end handler. He's not going to circle the ice 8 times with the puck and dangle through players and cut to the inside and all that. He's mostly an off-puck manipulator. But if you watch him, you know, in the KHL with SKA playing a top power play role for a team that usually is very stingy with their rookies and their prospects, right? I mean, it's very rare that
you'll see this recently too.
Yeah, with Aidan Demidov and Matvei Michkov. Michkov's still scratched, isn't he? I mean, it's just you see how they are with prospects and young players, and they're trusting Nikishin with top power play minutes with their pro team. I mean, that's saying something. I'm fairly confident in Alexander Nikishin being the better offensive player overall, just based on the mindset alone. He's just facing scenarios that Guhle just doesn't face regularly. There was one time I saw Kaiden Guhle carry the puck straight into the offensive zone and take a shot from the top of the hash marks, and that made me very, very happy. I mean, I saw glimpses of what Kaiden Guhle could be, but that was one instance, and I didn't really see that happen often. I want to see that happen often with Guhle before I can come up and say, I mean, this is something that should improve in his game. Whereas Nikishin's constantly doing this stuff. I mean, it's in his blood. It's in his nature as a player. It's not something you have to worry about with him of like, hey, go activate, go play, carry the puck, do something. I mean, with Guhle, it's just he's very, very focused on being. He's focused on being there for his team, whereas Nikishin's focused on being the team. If that makes sense. They're just fundamentally different players in terms of mindset. Guhle's trying to be the safety plug for his team, whereas Nikishin's trying to dictate play. So for me, it's just you compare the two and you look at that, it's just a mindset difference. But in terms of their tools themselves, they're fairly similar. Overall, I think Kaiden Guhle's going to for sure be the better defensive player, and Nikishin's for sure going to be the better offensive player. I think that's very clear in that comparison. Yeah. But in terms of overall impact on the game, you know, if you're looking to win a cup, who do you take?
Oh, it's so tough. This is the most annoying one on our list today, which is saying something because Edvinsson versus Simashev is also really annoying to have to pick on. I really like both of these players a lot for different reasons. I think there are more Kaiden Guhle style players out there than Alexander Nikishin style players. So I think I'd very slightly side with Nikishin, but that could also just be like, ooh, shiny object in the KHL putting up massive point totals. That's kind of skewing my perception a little bit here. And I have scouted both of these players quite extensively. It's just it's so tough when you have one that has played in the NHL and one that hasn't to then pick between them. But I think I'd very, very slightly be siding with Nikishin here.
I'm still on the Guhle train. I still think that Guhle he has some things that other defensive defensemen don't have. A lot of defensive defensemen don't have his skating ability. A lot of defensive defensemen don't have his understanding of when to pinch offensively, because he's still good at pinching. He just doesn't do it far and he doesn't do it often. But he still, when he decides to pinch, it's always the right time. That's one thing that I really, really like at Guhle's core, is that he understands the game of hockey at a deeper level. So I'm still very, very slightly leaning Guhle. But you know, if we're talking about, you know, you need a goal, it's third overtime, you need a goal. Nikishin, for sure.
Kidding.
That's just how I see it. But
if it's the last minute of the game and you need defense, you go Guhle.
Absolutely. If you have if you're in triple overtime on the penalty kill, 1 minute left on the period, Kaiden freaking Guhle all day. But yeah, I mean, they're very similar players with very similar profiles and tools. But it's going to be very interesting to see them both develop. But that wraps things up for today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe and leave us a comment. We keep our comments for our mailbag questions and make sure we select the best ones. So leave us all the questions you have. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your updates about the sporting world and what's going on in sports. And make sure to tune in for next week as we've got 5 episodes coming for you. This has been Hadi with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.